Now, the first point, René Girard's influence on Peter Thiel. René Girard was a literary critic, a literary theorist who developed a theory of mimetic desire. It took as his starting point the idea that our desires are not original, are not rooted in the individual, but actually are imitative insofar as we imitate the desire of other people, specifically the people we admire, what he called models or mediators. It's easy to understand Girard's triangular logic on mimetic desire if we think of children wanting to play, very often gravitating towards the same toy and then entering into a rivalry for the possession of the same object. Girard would argue that this is mimetic desire in the sense that the smaller child desires what the bigger child wants, and the consequence of this triangular structure, in which you have the subject, the model, and the object of the desire, is that rivalry automatically ensues. Now, this triangular structure, I argue elsewhere, is of Freudian derivation. It has to do with desire, with identification with father figures, and an ambivalent relationship with the model. So this is something that Peter Thiel doesn't necessarily explore, but I do explore it in a book titled Violence and the Oedipal Unconscious, where I trace Girard's triangular structure back to Freud and argue that Girard remains a Freudian thinker. Now, this triangular structure should be already enough to tell you why Peter Thiel was interested in social media like Facebook, that if you remember, started as a platform to rank the beauty of girls at Harvard University, and so it has been described as being a machine for generating mimetic desire and rivalry. If I desire what others desire, then there will be a competition to be the most desired or the most liked. And Thiel understood, as a student of Girard, this mimetic mechanism. And so he invested $500,000, not much at the time, but enough to get Facebook starting. And even had a suggestion to Zuckerberg. He suggested that he should add the like button. So every time that we use the like on social media, this is an idea that comes implicitly out of mimetic theory. It's a mimetic trick to add prestige to models or potential models whose desires we can then in turn imitate. And it is for this reason that Girard has been called the godfather of the like. So it's an example of a theory that had an impact on technology, even if Girard himself didn't establish that connection, but his disciple, Thiel. Now, as a student of Girard, Thiel should have been mindful of the potentially pathological or negative consequences of such a machine like Facebook generating mimetic desires, but also rivalry. There is a third concept that is important to Girard's thought and that follows naturally from his theory of mimetic desire, and that is the concept of the scapegoat. So if mimetic desire leads to rivalry for the possession of the same object, and there is a tendency of violence, Girard says, to spread contagiously from self to others, then an anthropological question, if we step back and consider how societies emerged, is how did humans manage to survive and not wipe each other out in never-ending cycles of mimetic violence? And Girard's solution to this problem is the notion of the scapegoat, in Greek pharmakos. His hypothesis is that, since there are sacrifices in many cultures, there was a period in anthropology in which sacrifice was very much studied, and anthropologists like Durkheim, for instance, or Fraser, noticed that sacrifices are present in different cultures and different religions. Girard's addition to this is that he posited the idea that if violence is directed against a sacrificial sacrificial victim, often a figure that can be marginal to the community, or somebody that can be central as well, like a king, for instance, who can be blamed for all the evils that plague a given society. I mentioned that Girard was very much influenced by Freud. Think of Oedipus Rex. There is a plague in Thebes, and Oedipus is, according to Girard, eventually considered responsible for this plague, and he is turned into a scapegoat, from king to scapegoat, as he is evicted from the city. In any case, the point for Girard is that this direction of violence against a sacrificial victim, which in his view is often arbitrarily chosen and innocent, there is a cathartic effect that ensues, and so the society can come together purified from the violence that afflicted it. So Girard posits the notion of the scapegoat, the sacrificial murder, again, not unlike Freud, at the origins of culture, at the origins of the sacred, and what we find in myth are representations of this original event that he posits at the origins of culture. Now, I mention the scapegoating mechanism because Facebook can be co-opted in order to generate scapegoating mechanism online that then spread contagiously offline as well. Now, I would say from the perspective of mimetic studies, which doesn't posit that only desires are mimetic, but that all emotions are mimetic, I call it mimetic pathos, then the assumption is that beliefs and aggression can spread directly online, especially on social media that are algorithmically programmed in order to amplify pre-existing beliefs. This can generate processes of scapegoating that start online and then spill offline with real violent effects. And there are a number of examples. Probably the most prominent one is Facebook implication in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar in 2016 and 2017, where hate speech spread via Facebook against the Rohingya population, and it did generate scapegoating mechanism, genocide in the real population. Now, Thiel, as a student of Girard, should have been mindful of the danger of scapegoating in social media, but that is obviously not his primary concern, not necessarily devoted to promoting peace and stability, but in, as I mentioned, technological acceleration. And so he's willing to put Girard's mimetic theory to an anti-democratic use, or rather abuse, that can lead, I argue, to new fascist politics. So I move to the second side of the presentation, Thiel's implication in new fascist politics.